It's just you've been listening to my voice a lot. You might find it nicer to listen to someone else reading. I thought Eve was putting her hand up then, but you weren't. You're doing your hair. Well, Ruth, you can fight over it. Great, thank you, Ruth.
The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behaviour, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to invite Rich to come up, and he's going to help us to engage with these words.
Afternoon. Just exactly, yeah. By about a minute, everyone just checks. Then, don't they? They think, is it really the afternoon? Yeah. For some people, it'll feel like 11:10. For some people, it'll feel like 3:10. But yeah, it's 1 minute past 12, I think. Hopefully, the slides will come up in a second. All set. So, title today is The Wise Church, What's Wisdom and How Can It Help the Church? I think Robin had kind of like some natty graphic design earlier, but I didn't get that. So I Googled, what is the colour of wisdom? And the answer apparently is blue. So there we go. That's what you've got. You've got blue. So today we're starting a new series on wisdom, on the wise church, and we're starting it by looking at the start of the book of Proverbs, which kind of feels right, doesn't it? You know, if you were to be asked to pick a single book in the Bible that's all about wisdom, Proverbs probably top of your list, would have thought, generally, you know, just anecdotally. Any others you would put in that category? So the front row feels much closer than usual this week. I don't know what it is. Sorry, Rebecca, we haven't met, but we have now. I mean, it feels, we do feel quite close here. Any other books in the Bible you would... Sorry? Psalms? There's definitely some wisdom in the Psalms. Yeah, Sarah? Sorry? Oh, Proverbs. Yep, bang on. Sorry, I couldn't hear you there, Sarah. Proverbs, yep. Any others? Sorry? Judges? Yeah. No, there's some wisdom in there from the Judges. I'd like to think that Judges are quite wise. If not very good at their job, one would have thought. Ecclesiastes, yeah, that's one of the kind of traditional wisdom books. And one other that in the Old Testament that people often put in the wisdom kind of bracket. Job is the other one. Job is the other one. And we'll get onto it a little bit, hopefully, if we have time. But I think there's a good shout for saying pretty much the whole Bible is wisdom literature. And when we start looking into what wisdom really is, and we look about how the Bible is a story, and largely a story of people living unwise lives rather than wise ones, but there's a lot to be learnt as a result of that. There's one book in the New Testament as well that people often point to as a wisdom book, if you were to isolate one. So it feels like a quiz now. It wasn't quite intended to be that. But New Testament, yeah. James, bang on, there you go. Right first time. When I think of wisdom, and I think when other people think of wisdom of a certain ilk, it's not working. Here we go. This is the person I think of. Does anyone recognise this chap? Sarah? The Gremlins. Oh, it's similar to a gremlin, but this guy is in a different series of films. Star Wars films, yeah. Yoda, to give him his full name, Grandmaster Yoda. Is anyone unfamiliar with Yoda in this room? Sarah, you're unfamiliar? Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, kind of extraterrestrial. Yeah. Eve is unfamiliar with Yoda. So for Eve's benefit, if anyone were to describe to Eve who Yoda is and what he's like, any bitty sayings. Unfortunately, Rooted aren't here, and they're pretty much the people here who know everything about Yoda. Sorry? Lessons in grammar, yes. Yeah, he tends to kind of speak German and put his verbs at the end of the sentence and that kind of thing, yeah. No, so he's this wise 900-year-old creature, and one of his sayings is something along the lines of, when 900-year-old you are, look as good as me you won't, which I think is probably fair. But he has all these famous sayings. I like his do or do not, there is no try. This idea of just kind of don't equivocate, just get on and do some stuff. And so his utterances are a little bit like proverbs. And this isn't going to work, is it? Oh no, there we go. You get proverbs in lots of cultures. So I wanted to kick off by sharing some proverbs, or encouraging people to share some proverbs from their particular language or their particular culture. I'll start with English ones just to give you some time to think about it, or in fact literally just one. Many hands make light work. Are people familiar with this? The idea that if we all work together, there's a big task to do. If we get together and we cooperate, we can make that an easy task. We can make it much more straightforward. In English, of course, we do also have an opposite one, which is, too many cooks spoil the broth, exactly. So be careful having lots of people do stuff, because it might be that it doesn't work out quite as you hoped. Hi, I didn't realise you were going to be here this morning necessarily, but Cantonese has amazing proverbs, doesn't it? Have you got any that you could share with us off the top of your head? Because when I saw you were here, I looked some up. And maybe you could tell me if any of these actually are real Cantonese proverbs. Now, should I try the Cantonese? Probably not. So, ai guai sik tofu, which is to trick a ghost into eating tofu. I don't know if you're aware of that one, which literally just means to trick someone, apparently. So, and there are various others here, none of which are probably actually accurate. So, any other proverbs people have? If not, I've dug a few out, and I've done it with great trepidation, because Google generally doesn't tend to be all that accurate when it comes to these things, but let's try anyway. I think live and let live, that's kind of like a saying or a proverb, isn't it, that we go with? I found a Brazilian one. I was going to say none of our Brazilians are here, but Anna is here. Is this a thing or not? It is. Never poke a jaguar with a short stick. I mean, it sounds sensible to me. I mean, I would start with never poke a jaguar. But if one were to poke a jaguar, don't do it with a short stick. What does it mean, Anna? Was it? Yeah. Don't kind of provoke her. Yeah. Yeah. Sensible advice. So remember that. Never poke a jaguar with a short stick. I looked up a Colombian one too. Conscious that we have Colombian members of the family here. Juan, I don't know if this means anything to you at all. The old dog barks while he is sitting down, apparently. I found the proverb. I have absolutely no idea what it means. Is this a thing? Right. Okay. There we go. Take that into your week and apply that. And Stella, I hadn't appreciated your. Oh, I see. Okay. It's all about experience, the value of experience. Stella, I hadn't appreciated you're from Nigeria, but I did find a Nigerian one as well. I don't know if this is a real one. The child of an elephant will not be a dwarf. It makes sense. It does actually make sense, but this is said to be, according to Google, a Nigerian proverb meaning like father, like son, as we would say. Or I think, do we have something like an apple never falls far from the tree, or that kind of thing, which is also quite an odd proverb, presumably for people who haven't heard it before. But that is, Anyway, that finishes my run through of proverbs from around the world. If people have others, we can chat about it after coffee. But that's not what proverbs really are about. So the proverbs in the Bible are about this, about living wisely in God's world. And that's why I was talking about how you could see almost all the Bible actually as wisdom literature, because it's stories of how people have tried to live in God's world, sometimes quite unwisely, sometimes wisely, but hopefully we can learn the lessons from all of that. And so what have we got in the book of Proverbs? We heard the intro earlier, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But it starts with that summary section. It then goes into about 8 chapters of a parent talking to a child, specifically a father talking to a son, with some pretty clear life lessons. And if you read it, they're quite clear, and there's some sound advice in there, and particularly not about kind of joining gangs and beating people up, and various other bits and bobs in there. And that gives you an insight, I think, into some of these proverbs. They are intensely practical. They are real world life situations, and I think there's a lot to be said for viewing wisdom in that particular way, and we'll talk about that. Then there's the personification of lady wisdom. If you read Proverbs, so that it sees wisdom as a person, as a lady in particular, and they're in conversation, and wisdom is saying stuff. And then it heads into the bit which it's most famous for, which is all these pithy sayings, some of which are very well known. And then it ends randomly, seemingly, with 2 chapters from 2 completely different people, one called Agur and one called Lemuel, with their sayings as well. So it's a collection of wisdom impartation in lots of different forms. And I think we know Proverbs, we know various sayings and all the rest of it. We can read through Proverbs and we can instinctively think, actually, that's true, isn't it? I mean, a lot of these things actually make sense. But that isn't really what biblical wisdom is all about. No, it's not about memorizing Proverbs and thinking, aha, this is the scenario, right, I'm going to deploy the proverb in this particular connection. And to give you an example of why that would be difficult, as if not to say completely impossible, if people have got it, have a look at Proverbs 26, 4-5, right? This is quite a famous one. So it says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." Smart advice, right? 5, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." So you have there 2 seemingly completely different instructions. The one is saying, do not answer a fool in accordance with his folly. Don't engage in all of that, because of the problems that follow from that. Or actually, you should answer them, because sometimes then it will correct them and it will clarify their thinking. And I think what that helps us embody and think about is that it's not just about taking a verse and thinking, aha, okay, now I am in a Proverbs 17 verse 13 territory and I know the answers to this particular scenario. It's not about memorizing lots of facts. It is actually about, these are helpful and they'll help us on our road to wisdom, but they're not wisdom. They're actually really just knowledge. And wisdom is much more about, yes, having knowledge, that is important, but deploying it in the right place at the right time in the right situation, and knowing whether you're in a Proverbs 26:4 scenario or a Proverbs 26:5 scenario. And that is true wisdom, as to know how you deploy it in that particular scenario. So we're not talking about a rule book here. We're not talking about, great, I can just take that and apply it. It's giving us tools to know how to approach life and how to deal with situations, big and small. And the word in Hebrew that we get for wisdom, there are quite a few of them, but the one I want to focus on, and the one that appears first in Proverbs, is this word, which is close to impossible to pronounce for people in from my background at least, which I think is something like chokhmah. Yeah, good luck with that. And really clear your throat in order to get it going. Chokhmah. And it is written in English characters, or in characters that we could roughly understand, like this and 25 other different ways, because they have to transliterate between the 2 languages. But what it really means is being greatly skilled. Chokhmah. That's what it means at its heart. And so when you look at artists and craftsmen in the Old Testament, they're described as having chokhmah. They're really good at what they do. And so when we're looking at chokhmah in this context, in the context of wisdom, what we're talking about is we're greatly skilled at living godly lives. That is exactly the same word, just deployed in this particular context. So it's about applying our craft, but our craft is living well and applying knowledge. And this idea with chokhmah is that it's really tapping into how the world runs best. You know, how God has woven these principles into the world and how we tap into that in individual situations. And it's really practical stuff. It's a shame that the rest of our Star Wars fans aren't in, because we could talk about the correspondence between chokhmah and the Force, but let's not go there for these purposes, because I think there is some crossover between the two. But what I wanted to do was to give this idea about wisdom being something which is just infused and ingrained into the system and into the world that God has built. Is if we flick onto Proverbs 8:22, and this isn't on the slide, and that's primarily to make you pick something up and read it for yourself. So it's Proverbs 8:22. It runs through to 31. It's quite a long passage which really labours the point that wisdom was there first, before you then go on and create the world and various other bits and bobs, or God goes on. So here it goes. So this is, I was talking about Lady Wisdom before. So when it says me here, this is Lady Wisdom. This is the personification of wisdom. So it says, the Lord brought me forth as the first of his works. The very first thing that God created, according to this, is wisdom. So before we get into light and dark and all the rest of it, the very first thing is wisdom, before his deeds of old. And then it basically kind of goes through the creation story and says, I was before all of that. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning, when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water. Before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the world or its fields or any of the dust of the earth, I was there when he set the heavens in place. When he marked out the deep marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. When he established the clouds above and fixed securely the mountains of the deep. When he gave the sea its boundary, so that the waters would not overstep his command. And when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was constantly at his side. Wisdom was already there. Wisdom was part of this process. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in the human race. And as we know from particularly Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, in fact the two different creation accounts, that our job is to rule and take care, and wisdom's there to help us do that. We're tapping into wisdom in order to be able to rule and take care of the world and creation in the best way that we possibly can. And in the course of preparing this talk, Robin reminded me of this book. Does anyone know this book? Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you come across Malcolm Gladwell. He's quite a well-known writer. He's a journalist. Tipping Point is one of his books, and various other things. And this book is called Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And I think in this book it reveals something to us about wisdom, or it's quite a good analogy for wisdom and how wisdom operates. And it's all about split-second reactions, about how our instinct and intuition, if it's well trained, and for us that means in the flow of the Spirit and in the flow of wisdom and in the flow of the way that God has built the world, that can give us great insight into the situations that we're in. Because it is possible to overthink. It's possible to over-deploy your knowledge. And he's not saying that knowledge isn't important. Knowledge is important. It's how you deploy it and how you can deploy it in individual situations. And I first came across this book because I was doing some client training when I was in Hong Kong. And we were talking about the importance, actually, of how experience is far more important in lots of situations than knowledge. Knowledge is the base, but knowledge on its own can lead you in all kinds of odd directions. But it's experience that really drives it forward. And one of the stories from this book that I really like is about, it's a researcher, a PhD researcher is talking to Malcolm Gladwell, and he's telling the story of a firefighter in Cleveland, in the States. And this firefighter was taking his team of men to a fire. They were called to a residential fire. It's what they described as a 1.5-story home. I assume it's kind of got a roof, a room in the roof or something like that. And they get there and they're told that the fire's in the kitchen at the back of the house and you need to fight this fire. So the firefighters break down the door, they bring their hose in, they begin dousing the fire. And when you spray water on a fire, you expect the fire to die down. You expect it to abate. That's what it's supposed to do. But it didn't. And it's like, oh, it's a bit odd. And this guy, the fire lieutenant, recalled later, he said, I just realised there's something wrong here. He couldn't articulate why or how or whatever else. He said, there's something wrong here, get out. So he got all of his people out within seconds. Moments after that happened, the floor collapsed. And if they'd been in the room, they would have fallen through the floor, and what they actually would have done is fallen into the real fire. It turned out the fire wasn't in the kitchen at all. The fire was in the basement. And he was asked later how he knew that, and he said, I didn't. And so someone said, you must have some ESP or something, extrasensory perception. How do you know about this? And they sat him down and for 2 hours to try and work out how he knew what he actually knew, but he didn't know that he knew it. And when he got to it, he said, I realised there was a problem actually instinctively because the fire wasn't responding as I expected it to respond. I was spraying water on it, it wasn't going down. The second thing was it was too hot. There was something about the room, it was too hot. If the fire had been at the back in the kitchen, it wouldn't have been as hot in the room that he was in. But of course it makes sense if the fire's underneath you. And the third thing was that the fire should have been louder. Apparently fires crackle. They're really, really loud if they're right in front of you. But it was really quiet because, of course, the fire was beneath him in the basement under the floor. And I really like the idea of having God's wisdom so ingrained in us, like him and his knowledge of fires, that we instinctively do the right things and we make the right choices and we say the right things because we're in tune with the running of the world. We're in tune with the way that God created things when he set wisdom up right at the beginning. And I think this is a really good example in this book, and there are loads of others. If you want to read the book, it's a good read. And very easy to read. It's a mixture of knowledge, it's a mixture of understanding, it's a mixture of insight, it's a mixture of experience. And that to me seems to be the accumulated picture of biblical wisdom. And there's this aspect to which wisdom is a gift, because Solomon asked for it. If you remember the story in 1 Kings, he had a dream. God said, what do you want? He said, give me wisdom. God expected him, and everyone else expected him to ask for money and land and riches and all the rest of it. And he said, I want wisdom to rule my people well. So there's an aspect to which we can ask for wisdom. But the point of books like Proverbs is you can pass it on as well. You can pass on wisdom and you can learn wisdom and you can take things from what other people have learned and what God has imparted to them. So it's not just something that comes from on high. There's an aspect to which it is a gift, an aspect to which we can grow in it and we can develop in it. One thing I do just want to say is, though, wisdom is not a magic formula. So there are some of the Proverbs, you read them, and it says, do X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C will happen. And I think, hopefully, 8 times out of 10, A, B, and C will happen. But they're not guarantees, they're not promises, but they are guides to the best ways of living and to making good decisions. And the reason why I was asking earlier about the other wisdom books in the Bible is because if you read Job and Ecclesiastes, you realise life is not straightforward at all. And that's why it's important when we read the Bible not to just pick out a little bit here, there, and everywhere, but to read the whole picture and the whole story of what the Bible's telling us. I mean, if you read Job, that guy wasn't making false steps. He was doing the right things. And yet, bad things happened to him. So, yeah, it's not an A plus B equals C kind of scenario here, but it does guide us in the right things to do. And even if we don't get the great outcomes, we do them because they're the right things to do, ultimately. And more often than not, good will flow, but that's not to say that in every scenario. There's a Proverbs in there about train a child up in the way he should go, and then later in life he won't turn from it. There are people who've had very sad experiences with their children where they have trained them up very well and their children have gone in different directions. It's not because they didn't train them up. It's not because they didn't follow the formula. It's just because life's a bit more complicated than that. So just a slight note of caution with some of the Proverbs. Say, yes, these are things we want to hold on to. Yes, these are things we want to do. but sometimes it doesn't always turn out quite as straightforward as we might have hoped. Right, let's head back to the passage, and we'll just wrap this up pretty quickly. So we've got the this, as I was saying to Robin earlier, we were talking about it. This is like, what you'd see on the back of a book. If you were to read a book and say, oh, why should I buy this book? What would it be useful for? And they've summarized it really well in the first 7 verses. They've said, it's Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what's right and just and fair, giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So as I was saying before, the Proverbs are like this accumulated wisdom over a number of different generations. They're ascribed to Solomon, but he can't have written all of them, because the last 2 chapters say they're written by different people. And there's another section where it refers to Hezekiah's men, and they were around 200 years after Solomon died. So so don't take that kind of too strictly, but they are in the stream of Solomon, in the stream of the wisdom that God gave him. But the point here with biblical wisdom and with the Proverbs is that we're trying to gain wisdom and instruction. Why? Righteousness, justice, equity, discipline. And all of it rooted in the fear of the Lord. And it's all intensely practical stuff. This isn't a highfalutin spiritual stuff. Well, it's that, but it is also intensely practical day-to-day decision making. When I was reading around about this, I read this quote. It said, the experiences of the world were for Israel always divine experiences as well. It didn't have this division between, that's the spiritual bit and that's the practical bit. It can all be driven by wisdom, and it can all be driven in our decision making by wisdom. When I'm at work and I'm talking to someone I manage and I'm doing their performance review, I want to be acting out of biblical wisdom when I do that. I don't want to say that's just, that's commercial law type stuff. This flows through everything that we can do, in the same way that when we're talking to our children and we're trying to help them out, and it just happens to be a fight over whether to eat their peas or their carrots. There are wise ways of going about those conversations, and there are ways that escalate them. And I don't always make the right decision on that one, but I hope that over time I can learn more wisdom and deploy it in those situations. So it's not just highfalutin stuff, it's intensely practical day-to-day decision making that we're looking to get out of biblical wisdom. And then, who's it for? Giving prudence to those who are simple. Sounds slightly derogatory, but anyway, we'll just go with it for now. Knowledge and discretion to the young, and let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. Short point there is it's for everyone. Wherever you are on your journey, if you're young and you're starting out in your biblical journey and in your relationship with God, and you're trying to learn wisdom and learn what a biblical life and a Jesus-led life looks like, it's all here. If you're a little bit further along the journey, if you're wise, if you're discerning, if you've been doing this for a while and you've picked up some stuff already, there's more to learn. There's more that we can get hold of. And I think it's really important that we can help each other grow in that. And, God created the whole of mankind. He made it a team project. No, he could have created it so he just said, well, one human, that'll do for me. That makes life a little bit easier. But he didn't do that. He, in Genesis 2, I won't turn it up because of the time, but Genesis 2 verse 20, he realised, I've got one human here. This isn't going to do the job. I need more. And so he made it from the very beginning a team game where we work together and we wisely work together. And I think one reason why it's important that we work together and we work on wisdom together and we work on life decision making together is because we have this crazy capacity for self-deception and sin, don't we? That lead us off, and our ability to self-justify and say, I think this is a really good idea, I think that's a really good idea. And what we actually want to do is learn from each other. And we want to learn from the people in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and in the New Testament who've been before us and learned some tricky lessons and in some tough ways. And also our current family, our current biblical church family. where we say, well, I'm facing this decision. Can you help me out? He's not here today, but Shid and I were having a conversation about his work a couple of weeks ago and trying to work out the wise way of dealing with a particular situation. And I think equally when we've made decisions and we think actually maybe that wasn't the best one, maybe we should sit down with some of our Christian family and say, was that a good way of doing it? Was that a less good way of doing it? What collectively can we learn? What wisdom can we gain from this? And I think this is all quite countercultural, because our society is very much driven by self-determination. There aren't any norms out there. There aren't any right and wrong ways of doing things. But wisdom says that there is. Wisdom says that it was created right at the start and it flows through the whole created order. And so we have to humble ourselves and say, actually, there are some things here which we can really get hold of, and we can get hold of together, and we can grow in together. So let me just wrap up with these 3 points, then I'll hand back to Robin. So the first thing is this idea that wisdom is for everyone. We just saw from the previous passage, whether you've been doing this a long time or not very long, this whole church family idea, we can still all grow in wisdom. There's still more for us to get from the Proverbs, from the Bible story as a whole, from each other, and the wisdom that God imparts through each of us. This second idea, this chokhmah, the wisdom is about tapping into God's way of running the world, being greatly skilled at living godly lives, and it being something intensely practical, where we bring together the spiritual and the day-to-day practical, the carrots and peas example I was giving earlier, as much as the performance review, or dealing with clients or dealing with whoever it is, other family members who you find difficult, whatever it may be. But there is biblical wisdom to be found which applies to our day-to-day lives, and hoping that we get it to a stage where it's so inculcated inside us, like that firefighter who realizes, hold on, I need to do something here, and reacts instinctively in the right way in the circumstances in which they present themselves. And then, this idea that wisdom is something that we pursue together. And I think it'd be an interesting thing to think about in home groups, to think about how we can grow in wisdom and how we can help each other in wisdom, not in the idea that there's one wise person who's got all the answers to all the circumstances, but we can share our experience and see what God is saying through that experience. So frankly, we don't have to repeat each other's mistakes, and so that we can act in tune with how God has created the world and how he's set it up. I'll hand back to Robin.
Going to ask Rebecca and John to come back up, and we're going to have a chance to just